Welcome, everyone. This is the third and last day of our event on maternities in pre-modern societies. We're delighted to have here today Dr. Katharina Rebay-Salisbury. I'm going to do a very short intro before I let her talk. That's why we're all here today. Katharina is an archaeologist with a research focus on European Bronze and Iron Ages. She completed her PhD in 2005. She also had a series of postdoctoral research positions at universities like Cambridge and Leicester in the UK. In 2015, she was awarded a ERC, like a European Research Grant, to work with a project that to us is very interesting because it's directly related to motherhood and maternity, called the value of mothers to society, responses to motherhood and child rearing practice in prehistoric Europe. She directs the research group of prehistoric identities at the Austrian Archaeological Institute, and she's currently a professor of prehistory at the University of Vienna, where she is also having where she's also developing some research projects, both funded by the ERC and the FWF, like an important Austrian science fund, analyzing barrier contexts and human remains in Central Europe. Katharina, please take it from there.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction. I'm very happy to be with you in Rio, albeit not in person and only online. I would like to tell you a little bit about my research on motherhood in the Bronze and Iron Age in Central Europe. And of course, this is a very archaeology-based approach. So we don't have any written records. Sorry to the historians in the audience. So we're trying to make all our conclusions from the archaeological evidence. I hope you can see the slides. Yeah? Okay. So Pedro has already told you about my ESC starting grant project, the value of mothers to society. This ran between 2016 and 2021. The basic idea was to investigate social responses to pregnancy, birth, and early child rearing in prehistoric societies, and to relate the social to the reproductive status of prehistoric women. So I basically wanted to know if and how women's social status changed as they became mothers, and how motherhood was conceptualized in the past. And so we're trying to take a long-term history approach, analyzing family changes and gender relations from the late Neolithic to the early Iron Ages in Central Europe. That's the time frame about 3000 BC to the modern era. And it's very pleasing to see that in recent years there have been quite a few people and projects trying to explore motherhood in greater depth. And the number of books and edited volumes on these topics has also increased. So regardless if you're taking a cultural historical or a social archaeology approach, there are bioarchaeological approaches, isotopic, and also just historical approaches to motherhood. It's a growing topic, and it's really exciting to be part of this community. So I would like to stress that I take motherhood to not be the same as parenting. Researching motherhood tackles both the biological aspect of pregnancy, parturition, and breastfeeding, and also the ideological and social aspects of childcare as being innately female and a set of practices associated with women. So they're not exactly the same, but there are substantial overlaps. And when I started my project, I've also always been asked, so why don't you study parenting, and what about the fathers? But one part of the answer is that in the patriarchal structure of gender ideology, mothers traditionally and historically, and still today, predominantly perform childcare rather than fathers. They do help and they do substitute at times along with older children. But using the term parenting hides and disappears the fact that mothers actually do most of the childcare, which is also ideologically associated with mothers as their appropriate role. So the other part of this answer is, of course, that the set of methodology we are using in archaeology and anthropology to understand motherhood is often only applicable to female individuals. So motherhood includes a range of cultural choices and practices in addition to the biological framework of social reproduction. And as Adrienne Rich defined it, motherhood can be taken to have two meanings. Um, One superimposed on the other, the potential relationship of any woman to her powers of reproduction and to children, and the institution, which aims that that potential and all women shall remain under male control. And it's been argued that women could never truly be free until they were freed from the yoke of reproduction. But also, Adrienne Rich argues that it's the patriarchal notion of motherhood, not the actual experience of mothering, that's the source of women's oppression. And it's quite true that feminism and motherhood have a very complicated relationship. So Andrea O'Reilly argues that it's very important that mothers have a feminism of their own, as their standpoint is often ignored. Mothers are already stretched thin by the competing demands of work and childcare, and there's very little time left for activism and in politics and also in research. So at the beginning of my project, I thought that women in the past are often depicted as going through exactly the same stages of life, from baby to girl and from mother to grandmother. And the transition to motherhood is taken as a natural, normal, and inevitable experience. But it's one of the most profound identity changes a woman might experience. In fact, real life is much messier. There are women who never married, women that were infertile or remained child-free, women who had one, two, or more successful pregnancies. But there's also women who died in childbirth, women whose children died, and women who became severely impaired and disabled from the bodily effects of pregnancies and childbirth. So I started out taking motherhood as a separate and an independent category of identity. And by doing this, we can raise a number of questions like what was the age of first pregnancy? How many children did mothers have? How many women died during pregnancy, birth, and confinement? How were women buried who died pregnant or in childbirth? Is it possible to differentiate mothers from women who have not given birth? And how did motherhood affect the social status of women and the way they were buried? What was the social role of women who did not become mothers? And is there any evidence for gynecological knowledge and medical treatment? These are all questions we can ask with and partly answer with archaeological means. Of course, there's also questions that relate to the babies. So how long were babies breastfed? At what age were they weaned? What evidence is there for breast milk substitutes? How does the diet of weaned children differ from adults, and can we identify connected material culture? Is there evidence for child abuse and neglect and infanticide? So in my ESC project, the leading hypothesis was that women who have given birth were socially defined differently from other women. Their social status changed when they became mothers, and the social responses to reproductive success or failure were culturally contingent. We always read in the literature that reproductive ability contributed to women's status and identity, but this is actually an assumption that has never been systematically tested. And we tried to set out to do this. But how can we identify mothers? So one strand of our research was dedicated to working on the skeletal pelvis to identify and understand the factors that contribute to pelvic shape changes and bony reactions in the skeleton. Our group has published a number of papers describing and associating pelvic features to pregnancy and parturition. And I think they're all available online and open access. So you can look them up if you're interested in that kind of research. Very short, we can sum up that there are age-dependent changes as women mature and a general tendency of accumulated pelvic changes with the number of children. But it's not a simple and monocausal a relationship, so it's very difficult to really relate archaeological material with um, trying to read how many children women would have. And we worked primarily on early Bronze Age cemeteries from Austria, and we've published a number of case studies to exemplify our approach. So here in this slide, this is from a PhD student, Lukas Waltenberger. He investigated the exact relationships between different kinds of pelvic features, like here in this picture, pubic pitting, and the number of births women have. And there is a relationship, but as you can see, births are not the only factor that feed into this. There is a number of factors that feed into this. So here are some of our published Bronze Age case studies that we did under Hauzenthal and Schleimbach. We selected them because the preservation of the skeletal material is very good, and we could look at the pelvises from the women in relation to how people were buried. Other threads we are still following include testing relationships between co-buried individuals with ancient DNA. So in 2015, which is an awful long time ago now, we applied forensic mitochondrial DNA approaches to confirm or rule out mother-child relationships. So in this case, you see a woman buried with two children. For those of you who are not so trained at reading skeletons, this is the skull of the woman. This is the trunk of the woman, and then the two children were found here behind her legs and in front of her face. And this was always thought of as being a grave of a mother with children, but DNA analysis has clearly ruled this out. It was clear that the children, who were 3 and 5 years old, had the same haplotype, so they might have been siblings, but the mother or the social mother couldn't have been related to these children. It's clear that kinship is not exactly the same as biological relatedness, and therefore it's also important to investigate how people are buried in relation to each other, and really investigate how emotional ties and social connections are staged in the burial ground. In this picture from Unterhausenthal, you see that the two children, 2 and 6 years old, are buried embracing each other. So it's clear that the burying community emphasized their social relation. And mitochondrial DNA has figured out that they share the haplotype, so they might have been siblings or very closely related. The field of ancient DNA analysis also developed very rapidly during the course of the project. So we started to collaborate with the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, and they can now detect relatedness up to the 9th degree in a cemetery. And this is really exciting because now in a small Bronze Age cemetery like this one from Drassenhofen, we can really exactly understand who is related to whom buried on this burial plot. And this is just in the process of being published, but I can share some secrets with you already. We have, for instance, seen that there is a newborn buried in this quadruple grave up here, and we know exactly that the mother is buried here, whereas the aunt is buried here, and these two sisters, father is buried here. So we can identify as family groups that are very closely also connected on the cemetery. They are usually buried in vicinity. But nevertheless, in terms of motherhood, it's really interesting to see that the baby burial is not actually with the mother, but in a different grave. This might have something to do with the sequence of how this grave plot was used, and that it was just basically one after another. And when a baby dies, then there's not an extra grave cut being made, but the baby is put in the next sort of open grave that's available. What's also very exciting is that we identified two individuals that died of plague. They were both adult men of relatively sort of the best age, between 20 and 30. And they were both at the edges of the cemetery. And in this case, with the upper burial, we know that the adult man who died of plague was actually buried with his mom. So there's another sort of reference to motherhood by having the skeleton of the mother together in the same grave. So this is very exciting stuff, and we're looking forward to more results here as these skeletons are still being processed. This is a bit of a long term thing. So if we wanted to sum up a number of the characteristics for early Bronze Age motherhood, we found a very young age of motherhood. We found no particular selection of mothers. We also found that the social status doesn't relate to how many children a mother has had, but it more reflects the reproductive potential of the women. So we find the richest burials are the ones of adolescent females at the age of between 12 and 16. And there is also no difference in physical stress through pregnancy and birth between poor and rich individuals. So this was a very interesting and surprising result, I thought. And then the questions come out of all mothers love their children. There's a wonderful paper by Marianne Hem Eriksson with this title, I believe. And we looked at a number of children who were clearly victims of violence. And one of our test cases was this child from Schleimbach in Austria. You see in the skull here, this child has 4 depression fractures in the skull, was clearly murdered and finished off very brutally, and was found in a burial pit, not in a burial, in a settlement pit in the middle of a Bronze Age settlement. And there's also this loom weight in here that might have been the murder victim. And in cases like this with infanticide, it's very important to understand, is this a girl or is this a boy that was murdered? Because this has implications of whether we think of this violent event as some intergroup violence or competition between groups. Normally, it's the case that in patrilineal societies, if there's a conflict, then boys are more often killed, whereas girls would just be taken away and captured. And for that reason, it was important to find out the sex of the baby. So what we did is we used a proteomic method of sex identification, was just testing sex-specific amylogenin fragments to sex the child. And we did indeed find out that this was a boy. So that makes it, of course, much more likely that this is intergroup violence. But it could also, the death of this poor boy might also have been something to do with chronic illness. We had changes in the ear portion here at the skeleton that would point to repeated middle ear infections, and that might also have impaired his hearing and made living together with this boy quite difficult. So this would also be a possibility to explain these findings. To answer the question of how many children women would have had in the early Bronze Age, we used some demographic modeling. The population growth rate and the total fertility rate correlate with the proportion of sub-adults in any given population. And so the total fertility rate indicates how many children a woman had on average if she survived to the age of 50. And to calculate all these indicators, one has to accept the assumption that the childbearing period roughly lasted from 15 to 50 years of age, and the life expectancy in the Bronze Age ranged somewhere between 20 and 30. And so using these parameters, we calculated from the cemeteries a fertility rate of about 8 children per woman at the early Bronze Age site of Unterhautsental and the Middle Bronze Age site of Pitten. So 8 children per woman seems rather high, perhaps, but it's important to understand that the total fertility rate also only applies to women if they lived to the age of 50. And with a life expectancy of 20 and 30, this only applied to a minority of women. So in fact, in our models, about 50% of the women survived to 15 years, entering the childbearing period, but only 25% of women were still alive at the age of 50. So in the Iron Age, we have much more evidence for motherhood, including iconographic evidence that motherhood was embedded in a social structure characterized by patrilocality and patriarchy. So at least for the elite, marriage was very important, but the ideology of motherhood did not extend to all women, and some persons were also characterized as sexless with no emphasis on family and on reproduction. There is some evidence for gynecological and medical knowledge, and also a lot of ambiguity in how to deal with the death in childbirth and deaths of newborns. There are a few images of pregnant women. So this image from the Situla of Montebelluna has been in. Here is this image of Montebelluna, where um, the authors think that the left woman here is showing a pregnant belly, whereas the woman right is the mother-in-law. Um, Images of childbirth are incredibly rare, even in the classical world. So we have one image on the Situla Pieve Pago from Italy, and there is a few other themes from around the Mediterranean, but it's not a very common motif. The question is also how many women died while pregnant or within 42 days of termination of pregnancy. This is the artificial definition of maternal mortality by the WHO. So the normal risk of dying is about 1.5% per birth. So if you calculate with 8 to 10 children, then you have a lifetime risk per woman of 10 to 15% to die in connection with pregnancy and childbirth. And this is quite striking because this number does not at all match the archaeological observations. I put together a database of women who were found pregnant in graves or were buried with a fetus in situ. And there is not that many in European prehistory. One possibility is that fetuses would have been removed prior to burial, but it's really complicated because the true maternal mortality rates depends enormously on cultural factors such as medical knowledge and also beliefs about hygiene, but also about the social status of women and their involvement in decision making. So this rarity of pregnant women in the archaeological record I found quite striking during my ESC project. There are some. So here I show you two Bronze Age examples. The early Bronze Age inhumation here um, had a little had fetal bones included that were only then discovered in the post-excavation work. And then this woman from Franzhausen was cremated together with a fetus in the 9th lunar month, and then they ended up both in this urn. But in the larger archaeological records, it's not that common. Yeah, this is one of our teenage pregnancies in the early Bronze Age. The individual from a case study Unterhautsental was found with a fetus remains. Unfortunately, there were no remains of the pelvis preserved, so we couldn't even sex the individual properly. And then the question was, how old was this teenager when they died? We took a second aging approach here with these teenagers, dental cementum annulation or TCA, where you do a little thin section of the dental root and then count up sort of the year rings of the dental cementum. And that gives you a different kind of age estimation than the morphological aging alone. This is important, particularly in our early Bronze Age studies, because the skeletal remains look younger than they are. So the dental cementum age is 17.5 years, whereas the morphological age would have put the women at a younger age. Yeah, we also did some dental cementum annulation to check the age differences between men and women buried in one grave. And here we have a 17 to 20-year-old woman and a male that was first estimated at 35 to 40-year-olds, and the gap between the ages derived from TCA is even higher. So what we can figure out in most of these Bronze Age situations where you have two um, a male and a woman in a grave is that it's a much older male and a younger female. It seems to be very characteristic. Here is another example from uh, several Iron Age graves. The Iron Age graves are striking, Iron Age graves of pregnant women, that is, are striking because there are some really high status graves and there are some that are buried in settlement pits. In Rottenburg-Lindele in Germany, there was a 20 to 25-year-old woman buried with very high status grave goods, whereas in the Czech Republic we found a skeleton in a settlement pit with a sort of really striking funerary gesture, kind of having the arms clutched like that. And you see here in the elbow region here is the fetus. So um, in this case, the woman was kind of disposed of in a settlement pit and not even properly buried on a cemetery. So we have both of these kinds of ways of dealing with pregnant women in death. And I think at the heart of this ambiguity in how to treat women is this insecurity of how do you really understand a pregnant woman? Yeah, is this one body or is it two bodies? I think this is a philosophical questions that people in the past would also try and understand. Yeah. Um, Okay, I'll just show you some more uh, pictures of pregnant women in the Bronze Age. Here in the cemetery of Vanshausen in Austria, where you have even more than 700 people buried, there's only 3 women buried pregnant. And sometimes you see that um, the burial references the baby. So normally you would only have 1 bowl per woman, and here you have 2, so next to the belly. So it's clear that here in this case, people who buried this individual would have thought the baby also needs a bowl and a gift. And the other thing that's quite important about burials of pregnant women is that they often come with cutting tools, with maybe this symbolizes the cutting of the umbilical cord or the cutting of life. We don't know. But there is interesting analogies with medieval burials where we see the same phenomenon. What we also see in the Iron Age is a considerable amount um, of gynecological knowledge and interventions. It was very interesting to see that in the 4th millennium BC, in the Latin period, you already have surgical delivery of uh, fetuses if the fetus got stuck in the during birth. So the very last resort, when it was clear that the mother and the baby would die together if something goes wrong in birth, would be to cut off the baby's arms and then deliver the baby through the birth canal in the last attempt to save the mother. And things like that. First of all, it's interesting that this is so early, but it's also interesting that it clearly shows you the mother's life was prioritized over the baby's life. Okay, so to start with a more cheery notion, not always talk about dead mothers and babies, I would also like to show you a little bit of what we did about feeding. We took several approaches to understand how babies were fed. Um, we did isotope studies, we studied dental abrasion, and we did organic residue analysis on feeding vessels. Feeding vessels are these small little vessels here that have an opening here on this side, or a little spout where you could feed liquid to a baby. And it's always been assumed that you use this for childcare or for caring for the elderly or the sick, but it has never been tested what was actually in it. And so we worked together with Julie Dunny and Richard Evershed in Bristol, and with various organic residue analysis methods, they found out that it must have been the milk of ruminants, of cows and sheep, that were in these vessels and that were fed. Yeah. We did a number of papers on this. Feeding issues. Yes, and here is just a picture of all these feeding vessels, because they're just really lovely, cute little forms that are not only to be understood as baby bottles, but also as nice pieces of material culture that babies would have also played with and engaged with. Yeah. This is just to show how they are found. Some are found on settlements. They're often stray finds, but also sometimes they end up in graves, like this one from Franzhausen Cockerhorn, which is also a beautiful example of a feeding vessel. And my friend Katharina did some experimental studies with a son of an archaeologist. She used applesauce to feed to little Noah, and confirmed that this is actually something that is really easy to do, and the children can handle these vessels all by themselves. Yes, and I think this was it. This was just to give you an impression of what we did during this motherhood project. I'm still very interested in the topic, and I hope that motherhood research is now really established. Lots of people are interested in it, and we'll see some really great things in the future. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Katharina. This is a brilliant presentation, and I think um, even for the historians that are watching us, it's been also very good to expose this variety of methodologies of ways that we can approach this topic, and to break down a little bit this stereotype that, well, it's almost impossible like to approach such themes when we're working with European prehistory, which is exactly not true. I really liked how your presentation was so diverse in the sense, like you brought a series of osteological ways of looking to this material, from like tooth cement to annihilation, but also like the DNA analysis, which are so rich for us, I think.
Yeah.
But also the artifactual analysis now with these feeding vessels. So I'm sure that there will be many questions. There's one already that someone posted on our chat, like a student, Juliani Santos Machado, and I would just like to translate it to you.
Yes,
She
please.
asked, are there any other examples of family connections like that of Drazenhof in Austria, but not just in the Bronze Age, but also in the Iron Age?
Uh, I would like to say not yet, but I know there's work in progress by my colleague Peter Ramsel, who is working on Iron Age cemeteries in Franzhausen, and they're also trying to do a series of DNA analysis where they can really show these connections. I think this is something that's now really a hot topic, the kinship analysis on cemeteries. And I was at the conference in Halle last year. There's going to be a nice book about this, I think, and it was fantastic to see so many groups working with this, because there's not very much published. Yeah, you can't find it in the literature quite yet, because people are still sort of working on it. Yeah, this includes my own project. I'm just in the project in the process of publishing all these. We have not only done Klassenhofen, we've done Steinbach and Unterhausenthal and a number of other cemeteries to varying degrees of completeness. Rasenhofen is special because it's so small that we could actually analyze all of them, and then you really see every connection. Yeah, by each connection, if you connect two individuals, if you add another individual, you kind of quadruple the insight. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
so previously it was forbiddingly expensive, and you only analyzed one or two individuals per cemetery. And now, as we see that we can do more and more, there's unbelievable stuff coming up. Yeah, so this is a little bit of this watch this space thing. This is a hot topic right now, and I'm sure we'll see great stuff in the near future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because it starts to grow exponentially, right? Because it
Yeah,
becomes easy. Yeah, yeah.
exactly. Yeah, the more individuals you add, and now we have found super connections between our cemeteries and some Czech colleagues. Yeah, because people moved, people moved everywhere, and people moved large distances. And I think in prehistory in general, we have underestimated this so much, and now we can plot it. We can see relationships up to the 8th degree, and we can see, okay, the 8th grandfather of this person actually lived in the Altai Mountains, and this kind of stuff is super exciting, I think.
Yeah, especially I think also if we apply this in terms of like gender, like to think of female mobility, which is also something that I think
there's something I think we don't quite understand yet, because wherever you look, the females move much more than the men, and it cannot be all down to just sort of marriage cycles and patriarchality. I think there needs to be a bit more of a sophisticated framework of interpretation, and more thinking about different kinds of mobility, different distances of mobility, and how they would show up in the archaeological record. There's an awful lot of stuff we don't see because, with strontium isotope analysis, we only pick up certain times in the lives of people when they could have moved. With DNA, we can only see ancestry, but not sort of back and forth movement. So I think there's a lot of things that we still have to kind of think a little bit more about until we get to real insights. And we need more data. I mean, it's a bit of a cliche, but the more data we have, the more pieces we put together in the big puzzle.
And I think this will be particularly interesting also to reframe some of the models that we have to explain cultural change, because like the idea, it's not just people, it's like ideas and styles and material culture, like you're showing, like circulating from one area to the other through those. I just have
I'm very interested in this also, and sorry, this is perhaps a bit digressing from the topic, but how people, for instance, the similarity of Paleolithic Venus figurines in Europe, you can only explain this by, there must have been an awful lot of them, by people must have actually found them and replicated them and seen them, and because the population density wasn't even so big that everybody could have just learned from each other. There must have been also transmission of ideas through the material culture and through people. So I think as an archaeologist, I advocate very much for not forget, with all this wealth of biological data that we now have and can interpret, not to forget the impact of material culture. That's also important, that also speaks to us and spoke to people in the past. So only in the combination of the archaeological context and the biological data and the material culture, we can actually move the field forward.
Elaine, if you don't have a question, can I would just ask her one question that I think is related.
I have loads of questions, but I'll send her some. But if you allow me one, you go ahead, you do your question, and I'll have one.
Okay, Katharina, this is connected to the question that Giuliani in the chat had asked. I was just intrigued by when you were presenting that cemetery of Unterhaltsenhall. I think that's how you pronounce it. You mapped it out in terms of like this DNA analysis, but also like in terms of the construction of this mortuary landscape, like showing those little guys who died out of pest, like to the side. I was just wondering, do we have any evidence, maybe in late Bronze Age or early Iron Age in that region, of people who were buried together, not necessarily in terms of like relatedness or kinship in a biological sense, but that had similar deaths or osteobiographies, in the sense that they perhaps died of similar way? Because I'm just asking this out of curiosity, because one of the cemeteries that I worked with in the northeast of England, like in East Yorkshire, there's one site called Kirkburn, and it's a famous place because it has a massive like chariot burial with like a chainmail and all of that. But right next to it, there's a big burial of a woman who died presumably during child labor. She still has the fetus in situ. But what's interesting is that it seems that a little bit, like maybe some decades after, there's a secondary insertion to
This is
that
the way
burial
we
often.
explain. Yeah, this is a really super cool. I've heard of that. Yeah, this is a
Yeah.
super cool finding. Yeah.
So is there anything similar, like of people who maybe died of a similar cause being buried together in the landscape?
No, what I find really weird about these sort of early Bronze Age cemeteries is that you do have some of these regular cemeteries, and then you always have quite a number of individuals that are buried in former storage pits. And then it becomes quite complicated because they are, some of them seem to be buried there in a sort of grave kind of manner. Some are just tossed in, some are even fragmented, yeah. Some are, and there is all different kinds of individuals. It's males, it's females. There's no particular selection that we could show. However, they are usually not related to the people in the cemetery. Yeah, so there might be some sort of social thing going on where you have different social groups living together. And Philip Stockhammer and his group, they have worked on cemeteries in the Lech Valley, where they're also thinking that there were kind of two groups, and the non-related group is the sort of low status group. So you might have something like a elite family that does this in the cemeteries, and sort of the rest that works for them. I think it's too few studies to really show anything like that. But in terms of the death, I thought in Strassenhofen with the two plague victims, this was very interesting because there's also two different strands of plague, and they so that means they didn't catch the plague from each other. These were different infection events, and they still have similarities in who they are and that they are buried on the edge. Yeah, so people, I think, would have understood that something was wrong with them, but was not quite, it was kind of an abnormal death. And that's the
Mm-hmm.
same with, like in this English example in Yorkshire, is that this is an unnatural death. Yeah, it's a bad death. It's a weird death. And especially in the Iron Age, I think we see um, pregnant women in all different kinds of weird situations that it wasn't quite clear how to understand it. People had problems to conceptualize death in pregnancy, I think.
Mm-hmm.
and and so it was sort of not entirely unexpected, because for that it would have happened too often, but it was also still a death that was not ordinary. It was
Yeah.
not a good
Very
death.
traumatic.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Eleni, if you want, go for it.
Thank you. Thank you, Pedro. Thank you, Katharina. That was a great presentation. And I agree with you. It's so exciting that we, have so many studies happening around the world and with many aspects on motherhood. So as you said, motherhood is visible now, and it's great. There were two aspects that really sparkled my curiosity. One, I would just comment because I thought it was very interesting that the three papers on archaeology we had on this conference, yours, Pedro's, and Aileen's, all touched at some level on the aspect of emotion, like the communal emotions behind those burials. So that's really interesting to see, how the history of emotion is being connected to that study
Yeah.
of human remains. But since we are all here to talk about motherhood, I think I'll actually focus on something else that also I asked Pedro yesterday on his presentation. He was talking about how in the community he studies, weaning took place relatively early, or early to what we would expect from earlier human communities. And it's very interesting that you have been working with breastfeeding. So I was just wondering if you have studied the whole connection between the number of pregnancies women might have happened and the process of weaning, and why they had to resource, the pottery, the ceramics, if that happened in a later life of the baby or how early. But basically that connection between number of pregnancies and
Yeah.
breastfeeding and weaning, if we can know anything about those communities in that sense.
Yeah, so actually, at the beginning of the project, I wanted to do nitrogen isotope studies on children's remains to understand uh, the weaning age. However, during it then turned out that the elevated nitrogen levels can also tell you something about starvation and disease, and so it's not so clear cut on an individual level if you can really connect it to weaning. And then we did a number of carbon nitrogen studies in the course of C14 dating, and it was, to be honest, very boring, because it always was the same result, that you have sort of this sort of 1.5 to 2 years old, and then they would have been weaned. Yeah. So we then decided to not pursue this any further, because we couldn't get the detail out of the data that this would have that we would have wanted. What we can observe is that the frequency of these feeding vessels is particularly high in the late Bronze Age and early Iron Age in Central Europe. And this might have something to do with the process of urbanization, where people live more closely together. And I mean, I'm just sort of interpreting here, yeah, there's no real evidence for that, but it might have necessitated women to be as workforces separated from the babies more often, and then you would have to have this supplementary feeding in place, because otherwise it makes no sense. Yeah, it makes no sense. It's unsafe, it's unhygienic, it's really the last resort. Yeah, you would do a lot of other things like cross nursing, having a wet nurse and so on, before you do bottle feeding. This is really not a good idea. People must have known that. Yeah. So I think it might be, in a way, a comment on a very specific social situation where women are apart from the babies. But we don't really know if this has anything to do with weaning age and spacing of children. I think one explanation is also that it has something to do with status building. So elite women in many of the historical society would have been urged to have as many children in close succession as possible. Yeah. So I think I would rather expect something like that you have elite women giving more birth to more children and then substitute feeding, and non-elite women not having this and having longer spaces between the births. But it's really difficult to get at this resolution, because we just don't have the numbers. Yeah.
Yeah, this made a connection with something that you were presenting during your talk about the aspect of relatedness. I thought it was interesting that in the continent, at least, there seems to be a lot of evidence of mothering going beyond biological relatedness, as you showed. And I was thinking in terms of uh, perhaps a system of care that is also kind of communal care, in that sense, in which,
Yeah.
like, not just the mother or it's her closer family
Yes, I
group.
mean, I think going back to Elaine's comment on emotion, I think this is why the observation of the archaeological context is so important, because with the children embracing each other, or with a mother embracing a child, you really do see this emotive connections on the ground. Yeah. What I struggle with a little bit is how to actually sort of measure this. I think it's very intuitive. You see these contexts, and you're like, they speak to you, and you see, okay, wow, they must have. This is kind of love being expressed, but it's very subjective in a way. Yeah? It's hard to measure. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's hard to measure. And I think through these contexts of love and emotion, you see that there are also entirely unrelated women who cradle children, and who are buried with them, and who hug them. And I mean, I didn't show this, but there are several things, like people in storage pits, where you have like one mother hugging one child and things like that. So and having two children, and one is related and one isn't. Yeah. There's surely more going on in terms of mothering practices than just the biological relatedness as well. But I was trying to look in this project from some identity point of view, what it does to the mother when she becomes a mother. Yeah. And this has a physical and a sort of a bony imprint, sometimes even a physical effect on the mother, and a large effect on how the identity of the woman changes. And so motherhood is a cool topic. You can look at it in very different angles, but you can certainly include all different kinds of women who are caring for children which are not their biological children.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's interesting that it seems that by in this area of Austria, maybe the south of Germany, like Baden-Württemberg and all that, like you said, social status doesn't necessarily relate to how many kids they have, but there is a connection with being in those years of reproductive age, which to me is striking because in older Iron Age, more middle to later Iron Age chronologies in some areas, including the British Isles, it seems that women who died more in a senior age, outside of reproductive stage or even menopausal stage, they seem to have a little bit more of a monumentality around their burials than the young
really?
ones.
No, I thought this is really interesting because if you look at the sort of development, then the children are sort of worth not very much.
Mm-hmm.
Then for women, this increases massively with reproductive age.
Mm-hmm.
And then it actually tapers off in adult age. And for old women, there is some that are rich and some that are very poor. So, and I've always wondered why that is. Is this a comment perhaps on successful reproduction and not? Because one could imagine that the women who are buried with nothing, old women, that their children had died, for instance. They might have been mothers, but they would not have had a line to fall on to.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just one interpretation, but it's interesting that you see sort of this gap opening between the rich and the poor in the old age group in the Bronze Age society. But I find this anyway incredibly interesting, how to think about how people would have valued a life at a certain age. And even if you think of it, about newspaper reports, somebody was run over by a truck. This is much more tragic if it's like a 12-year-old than if it's an 80-year-old. And I thought these subjective values of people are something that we think we can approach with how people are equipped in the burial practice, but actually we don't really know. There might be completely different factors behind it, like inheritance rules, or maybe you have nobody to give your jewelry to, so therefore you're buried with it. There is so many unknown factors that we're actually speaking from very little evidence.
Yeah. That's perfect. I think, Eleni, what do you think? Are we on time? Do we have time for one more? What about you, Katharina? Too, we are. Oh no, we're past. In theory, it's not 1 hour yet, but yeah, we passed the time that was planned already. So,
okay.
I think we have this, and
yeah, because we had that delay in the beginning with the YouTube. But I would like to
wrap up if that's all right. I thank you both for the opportunity to speak to you, and keep up the good research on motherhood. I think there's plenty more needed for that, and I wish you best of luck for that.
Yeah, and hopefully we'll see you in Rio, maybe in the next year. Or,
that would be lovely.
Yeah.
nice. Thank you so much.
Okay. Cheers.
Clarissa.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Clarissa, if you can stop.